Hey, bud. You mind if I sit down next to you?
Yeah, go ahead, buddy.
Why?
Hey guys, welcome to the very first episode of Fast Lead Therapy. Today we're going to be focusing on the Lone Wolf 40-9 conversion barrel. What I have with me today is I've got a Glock Model 22, I have a Model 17, and then I also have the Lone Wolf conversion barrel in 9mm. We're not going to actually be reviewing the 40-9 conversion barrel. There's a million reviews already on the internet. They've been around forever. Today what we're going to be focusing on is reliability and most importantly ejection, because that's where I've noticed the biggest weak point with them. So what we're going to do is we're going to shoot a few rounds from our Model 17 and 9mm, give you a good idea of what a 9mm should be ejecting like. We're going to shoot a few rounds out of the 40 Smith & Wesson. We're going to get a good idea of what a 40 is going to look like. Then we'll swap the barrel into the 40 Smith & Wesson pistol. We'll shoot a few rounds so you get a good idea of what the ejection is going to look like that way. Then we're going to slowly start changing parts and showing you how each part is going to affect it. Namely, what we're going to be changing today is we're going to be changing trigger housings, which is the part that actually contains the disconnector as well as the ejector. And then we're going to be changing recoil springs. The only difference in any of these setups that we're going to have besides factory is going to be I have a stainless guide rod, and the main point of this is just to make it a little bit easier on us so we're not unwrapping a spring off of a factory Glock plastic guide rod. The biggest reason why you're going to want to do the 40-9 conversion is the price of ammo. I have 2 boxes of ammo right here, each from the exact same manufacturer, same type of ammo, except one is going to be 40 Smith & Wesson and then the other one is going to be a 9mm. The price difference on these, I've already paid for my Glock barrel. The Alpha Wolfs run generally about $130 in the threaded version with a thread protector. But as you can see, 40 Smith & Wesson runs $18 to $21 a box in Blazer brass if you buy it at your local gun store, where the 9mm runs about $11. So we're talking a $7 savings over the course of 1,000 rounds you've already paid for your conversion barrel. So enough talk, let's get to shooting. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and shoot the Glock 17 chambered in 9mm, and it's completely factory. And this should give you a really good baseline of how a 9mm chambered Glock is going to eject its rounds. We're going to fire 5 rounds out of this, and then we'll move on to the 40 Smith & Wesson Glock 22, and we'll work on our barrel swap and our upgrades. So let's gear up. So if you'll notice, our ejection pattern is going to be behind us and to our right. Let's go ahead, shoot the 40 Smith & Wesson, and we'll go ahead and see what that looks like. Alright, so what I've got now is a Glock 22 chambered in 40 Smith & Wesson, and we're going to go ahead and fire it. It's completely factory recoil spring, ejector block, and everything. And then this should give you an idea of what a completely stock 40 Smith & Wesson chambered Glock is going to fire like. As you can see with the 40 Smith & Wesson, the ejection and the recoil is a little bit tougher, and it is definitely a snappier of a round, but it also ejects a little bit further than what the 9mm is going to, and a little more reliably. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go ahead, swap our Lone Wolf barrel into the Glock 22 so that we're able to shoot 9mm through it. Now we're going to do that without changing anything else other than the barrel, and then that should give you an idea of what the ejection pattern on that's going to be like. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead, we're going to take our Lone Wolf 40-9 barrel, and we're going to swap it into our Glock 22 and 40 Smith & Wesson. But first, what I'd like to point out is when it comes to the Lone Wolf barrel and the Glock barrel, dimensionally they look very similar, except for the Lone Wolf barrel is going to be a little thicker around the diameter of the barrel, and the chamber is going to be a little bit thicker. And the whole point behind this is to take up the slack, because the Glock 22 has a physically wider slide. Now, to change the barrel out, if you've ever field stripped your Glock 9mm or your Glock 40 Smith & Wesson, it's the exact same procedure. So we're going to go ahead, make sure the gun's empty, going to dry fire, pull the slide back ever so slightly, and pull the takedown detent. After that, you're going to want to remove your recoil spring and guide rod, and you're going to want to remove your 40 Smith & Wesson barrel. Now, I have the threaded Lone Wolf barrel, so it comes with this knurled thread protector on it. We're going to go ahead and unscrew that. We're going to drop it into our 40 Smith & Wesson slide, and then we're just going to go ahead and replace the recoil spring. And then we'll just reinstall our slide back onto our pistol. Alright, so now what we've got in our hands, we've got a Glock Model 22, originally chambered in 40 Smith & Wesson, and we've got our Lone Wolf 40-9 conversion barrel in it. We're going to shoot a few rounds, and we're going to give you an idea of what the ejection pattern looks like with a stock 40 Smith & Wesson trigger housing and with the stock Glock recoil spring and guide rod. So let's ear up and shoot some rounds. Alright, so what you may have noticed just there is the ejection pattern. All of the rounds are right around here, and I actually had one shoot out to the left side of me, and that's a very, very, very weak ejection pattern, and that's also a very erratic ejection pattern. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and swap in the Glock 9mm trigger housing, and we'll take a few more rounds with that. So now what we're going to do, we've got our Glock Model 22 with the Lone Wolf 40-9 conversion barrel in it. We're going to change our trigger housing. The trigger housing is the part of a Glock pistol that has the ejector in it. The ejector is actually the only difference between a 40 and a 9mm. The difference is going to be on the 40, your ejector right here is going to be pointed straight ahead, whereas on your 9mm, the ejector is actually canted ever so slightly to the right to catch the 9mm case. Alright, so now we've got Glock 22, Lone Wolf barrel, and we've put the Glock 9mm trigger housing inside of it. And so we're going to fire a few rounds, we're going to see how it ejects then. So as you can see, ejection's become a little bit more reliable. It's now showering the brass behind me a little bit and to the right. We didn't have any that flipped over to the left side. Alright, so now what we've got is our Glock 22 with our Lone Wolf 40-9 conversion barrel. We've got our 9mm Glock trigger housing with the 9mm ejector. And then we changed from the factory Glock 19-pound recoil spring to a 17-pound recoil spring from Lone Wolf. The only difference I feel like I should mention is just for the ease of changing the spring out, I went ahead and swapped over to a stainless guide rod since it can be taken apart with an Allen wrench. So let's go ahead, fire a few rounds, and we'll see where it goes from there. So in conclusion, your Lone Wolf 40-9 conversion barrel could be just as reliable as your factory Glock barrel, with just a few upgrades. Everything I shot today was done using Blazer Brass 115 grain 9mm. I generally don't have an issue with Blazer Brass. However, when I shoot Winchester white box in 115 grain, I see a lot of stovepipes, and that's regardless of whether I'm limp wristing or not. If you're gonna spend the $130 or so to pick up a barrel, I'd suggest to spend the extra $15, $20 and just go ahead and pick up the 17-pound recoil spring and the 9mm trigger housing, which is going to have the 9mm ejector in it. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Ah, it's hot! It's so hot!